If you've lived in Maryland all your life, there's a good chance you've passed places where entire towns once existed without ever realizing it. Across this state are places where entire communities disappeared, and today many of them are gone for reasons most people never hear about. These are 12 ghost towns in Maryland, and number 1 is the one locals still talk about. Number 12, Warren, Maryland. Just north of Baltimore, along the Gunpowder River, there was once a town built around mills that had been running for over 100 years, where generations of families lived, worked, and expected to stay, with a school, churches, and a community that had been there long enough to feel permanent. This was a town of 900 people, and the city of Baltimore decided to destroy it, forcing everyone who lived there to leave without anyone even knowing it was happening. At the turn of the 20th century, Warren was a working mill town in a valley that would later become part of the Loch Raven watershed, and everything in it revolved around the mills that produced heavy canvas and grain, keeping the town alive for decades. But while life there continued as normal, the city had already made its decision. In 1908, Baltimore approved a major expansion of its water system. But what the public didn't know was that officials had already arranged to take control of the entire town before the vote ever happened, setting everything in motion long before anyone living there had any idea. By the time the deal became public, it didn't matter anymore. In late 1921, a reporter walked through Warren as it still stood, with church bells ringing and children in the streets thinking about Christmas, documenting a place that was about to disappear. Within weeks, the mills shut down, buildings were dismantled, homes were torn apart, and even the graves were dug up and moved, as the town was slowly taken apart piece by piece. And then, the valley was filled with water, covering everything that had once been there. The town was gone. Today, the reservoir sits quietly over it, with walking trails running along the surface where streets once were, and most people who pass through have no idea there's an entire town beneath them. Number 11, Port Tobacco, Maryland. This was once one of the most important towns in colonial Maryland, a place that helped shape the region and, over time, slowly disappeared. At its peak, it was the second largest city in the state, serving as a center for trade, politics, and daily life. Where ships arrived regularly, tobacco was prepared for export, and decisions that affected the entire region were made, giving it every reason to keep growing. But it didn't. This was a town with that kind of history and importance, and it wasn't destroyed by war or fire, but instead was slowly undone by the land around it. For generations, tobacco farming stripped the soil from nearby fields, and with nothing left to hold it in place, that soil washed into the river year after year, gradually filling it in until the waterway that had once made the town possible became too shallow for ships to use. The change wasn't sudden, and at first it likely went unnoticed, but over time the river that had built the town became the very thing that made it impossible to sustain. When the railroad eventually came through the region, it bypassed the town entirely, and without access by water or rail, there was no reason for businesses to remain. A courthouse fire in the late 1800s gave officials the final excuse to move the county seat elsewhere, and within a few years, the town's role as a center of activity was effectively over. What remains is unusual because the town declined so quickly and was never rebuilt, leaving much of it preserved beneath the ground almost exactly as it once was, making it one of the richest archaeological sites from the colonial era in the country. Today, only a handful of people still live there, and a place that once stood at the center of trade, politics, and early American history has been reduced to almost nothing. Number 10, Kempton, Maryland. This was a company town where everything people owned came from one place, and when that company decided to leave, it gave them a week's notice, took back the money it had paid them, and walked away. Kempton was built in the early 1900s around a coal mine in western Maryland, and over time it grew into a fully controlled company town where hundreds of people lived in company-owned houses and were paid in their own form of currency that could only be spent at the company store. For years, that system worked, or at least it seemed to, but it meant that when the company made a decision, everyone else had to live with it. In 1950, a notice appeared in the store window announcing that the mine would close in 1 week, and the people living there had no time to prepare. As the shutdown began, the company collected back its own currency at a reduced value, and once it had taken what it could, the remaining coins were dumped down the mine shaft and buried, as if the town itself was being erased. Within weeks, the mine was abandoned abandoned, and the pumps that had kept it dry were shut off, allowing the tunnels to slowly fill with water that became acidic as it passed through the exposed coal and rock, carrying chemicals that would continue to leak out long after the company was gone. Over time, that contaminated water began draining into nearby streams and eventually into the Potomac River, spreading the impact far beyond the town itself. The company left in 1950, but the damage it left behind never really did. What remains of Kempton today is almost nothing. A few houses, the ruins of the old store, and a landscape still shaped by what was left behind. Number 9. Frenchtown, Maryland. This was once one of the most important crossing points in early America, a place thousands of people passed through on their way between major cities, sitting right in the middle of how the country moved at the time. At its peak, it served as a key stop along the main route between Philadelphia and Washington, where travelers would move between land and water, turning it into one of the busiest and most essential connections in the region. That level of importance made it a target. In 1813, British forces arrived by water and burned the town, destroying its docks and warehouses and leaving much of it in ruins, a moment that showed just how valuable the location really was. The community rebuilt, and for a short time, it looked like it might continue. But what ended it for good wasn't war, it was progress. Just a few years later, a canal opened nearby, creating a faster and more direct route that made the entire crossing unnecessary. And almost overnight, the flow of people and goods disappeared. Businesses closed, families left, and within a decade, the town had effectively emptied out. Today, there is almost nothing left. No buildings, no visible foundations, just a marker by the river where one of the most important crossings in early American history once stood, and where thousands of people passed through without realizing how quickly a place like that could disappear. Number 8. Daniels, Maryland. This was a town that survived fires, floods, the Civil War, and the Great Depression, only to be shut down by its own owner after more than a century of holding on. It began in the early 1800s as a mill town along the Patapsco River, growing into a fully controlled company town where nearly everything, from the houses and shops to the recreation spaces, was owned by whoever controlled the mill, making the entire community dependent on a single industry. Over time, the town changed names as ownership shifted, but the structure of life there stayed the same, with generations of families living and working in the same place, tied closely to the mill that sustained them. Even through major events like the Civil War, when the mill produced supplies for the Union Army, and through repeated fires and floods, the town continued operating. That stability ended in the late 1960s, when the company chose not to modernize the housing and instead gave notice to the remaining families that they would have to leave, eventually demolishing the homes and dismantling much of the town itself. A few years later, a major hurricane pushed heavy flooding through the valley, washing through what remained and scattering debris deep into the surrounding woods, leaving the town with no chance of recovery. Today, the area is part of a state park, and most of the town has been reclaimed by the forest, but traces still remain if you know where to look. The stone arches of the old church still stand above the river, and in a nearby ravine, a few abandoned cars sit rusting where the flood carried them, untouched since they were left there. Number 7. Fort Ritchie, Maryland. In the mountains of western Maryland, there was a military installation where an entire community lived and worked, built around operations so sensitive that much of what happened there was never fully explained to the public. Over time, it developed into a self-contained town, with homes, streets, a school, and daily life taking place inside a base that was also handling intelligence and communications tied to some of the most critical moments in American history. During World War II, it processed information coming out of Europe, and in the decades that followed, it became part of the systems designed to keep the government functioning during a nuclear crisis, including facilities built to survive one. For the people living there, everything about life was tied to the base, which made what happened next harder to predict. In the late 1990s, the military shut it down, but instead of clearing the site or redeveloping it, the property sat in transition while families were allowed to remain in the housing without being told how long they would be able to stay. That situation situation continued for years, turning into nearly 2 decades where people were living inside what had effectively become an abandoned military installation with no clear timeline for when they would have to leave. In 2017, the remaining residents were finally forced out, leaving behind a complete town still standing behind a locked fence. What remains is unusual even by ghost town standards because the streets are still laid out, the buildings are still there, and the structure of daily life is still visible, but no one lives inside it. Even now, the site remains in a kind of limbo, with no clear future, as if the place never fully shut down, but never fully moved on either. Number 6. Monacy, Maryland. This is a ghost town nobody has ever found. Monacy is considered the oldest European settlement in western Maryland, first established around 1725 by German settlers near what is now Frederick County. It appears in colonial records and land surveys throughout the 1730s, a trading post, a mill, a ferry crossing that George Washington's diaries mention, with a letter from 1730 describing it as a functioning community. Then the settlement was abandoned in the early 19th century and vanished, not demolished, not burned, not flooded, just emptied out and forgotten. Despite extensive archival research and multiple field surveys, the actual physical location of Monacy has never been confirmed. The most likely site is somewhere near present-day Kriegerstown in Frederick County, but no foundations, no wells, no artifacts have ever definitively placed the town on the ground. It is the only ghost town in this list, possibly the only ghost town in America, where the mystery is not what happened to it, but where it was to begin with. Number 5. Holland Island, Maryland. This was the most populated island in the Chesapeake Bay, a genuine Victorian community of watermen and farmers, and the bay swallowed it so completely that one man spent 22 years and $150,000 trying to hold the last house above the waterline before it finally collapsed in 2010. Holland Island sits in the middle of the Chesapeake Bay off the coast of Dorchester County, 6 miles west of the mainland. By 1910, it had 360 residents, watermen who dredged oysters and caught crabs, a school, a doctor's office, 2 stores, 90 working vessels, and a baseball team that traveled to other islands by boat. The houses were Victorian style, neat and substantial. The island felt permanent, but the land underneath it was not. Holland Island is made entirely of silt and clay. There is no bedrock beneath it. In 1914, the shoreline began visibly eroding. Residents tried to import stones to build walls and sank old boats along the shore to slow the erosion. None of it worked. A tropical storm in 1918 damaged the church. Families began disassembling their houses, loading the lumber onto boats, and rebuilding on the mainland in towns like Cambridge and Crisfield. And some of those houses are still standing on the eastern shore today, reassembled from an island that no longer exists. The last holdouts left in 1922. In 1995, a former minister named Stephen White, who had grown up on the island as a boy, purchased the last standing house for $70,000. He spent the next 15 years building walls of rocks and timbers and sandbags around its foundation, bringing in excavating machines and bulldozers, spending an estimated $150,000 trying to hold back the bay. By the end, at high tide, the house appeared to be sitting directly on open water. In October 2010, it finally collapsed. A gravestone recovered from the island read, "Forget me not is all I ask." A minister found it when he came back to an island that had already forgotten everyone buried there. Number 4. Conowingo, Maryland. This town didn't flood, burn, or get bypassed by a railroad. It was simply in the way of a dam, and the dam that drowned it has since captured so much sediment behind it that engineers warn the next major flood could trigger one of the largest ecological disasters in Chesapeake Bay history. The original Conowingo was a small Cecil County community on the Susquehanna River, built around a ford and later a bridge crossing that had been in use since colonial times. George Washington crossed at Conowingo, and the town had served travelers for over 2 centuries. In 1926, the Philadelphia Electric Company began constructing what would become one of the largest hydroelectric dams in the eastern United States. The reservoir behind it would flood the original town site, so residents were relocated a mile away to higher ground, and the original community was inundated when the dam was completed in 1928. The town that exists today as Conowingo is not on the original ground. The original site is under the reservoir. Unlike Warren, which was secretly purchased and demolished, Conowingo's relocation was orderly and acknowledged, but the result is the same. The place where people lived and worked for 200 years is underwater, and the dam sitting above it has captured an estimated 160 million tons of sediment since 1928. When a major flood eventually overtops it, that load will flush into the Chesapeake Bay in a single event. The dam that swallowed the town has become a problem that dwarfs it. Number 3. Harmony Grove, Maryland. This town survived being abandoned for 50 years, every building still standing, the church, the inn, the old road. And then a highway project came through and demolished most of it anyway. It got a second death long after the first one should have finished it. Harmony Grove was a small milling community in Frederick County, Maryland, built along a creek that powered a grain and grist mill from the early 19th century. The town was never large. A mill, a church built in 1878, and the Springbank Inn, but it functioned as a quiet agricultural service community for the surrounding farms for nearly 100 years. The mill closed in the early 20th century, and by the 1920s the population had thinned to almost nothing. But the buildings remained, and what survived was more than most ghost towns preserve. The 1878 stone church, the Springbank Inn, a few original structures along the old road. Then in the 1960s, highway expansion came through Frederick County. The buildings that had outlasted the economy of Harmony Grove for half a century were demolished for road construction. The church and the inn survived, but everything else was cleared. What remains today is a historic district on a road that curves past two old buildings and continues into subdivisions. The 1878 church is still an active congregation. Services still held in a building that outlasted everything the town around it could not, which makes it a ghost town that the highway bypassed once and then came back to demolish, leaving one thing standing that refuses to stop. Number 2. Relay, Maryland. This town existed entirely because of one bridge, and that bridge is still standing after nearly 200 years, still carrying trains, while everything built around it has completely disappeared. The Thomas Viaduct was completed in 1835 as part of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad's main line, the first multi-span masonry railroad bridge in the United States, curving across the Patapsco River on 8 stone arches. The town of Relay grew up around the junction where the B&O's Washington branch split off from the main line to Baltimore, creating a busy interchange point where trains stopped for water, coal, and crew changes. At its peak, Relay had the Viaduct Hotel for railroad travelers, a post office, homes for railroad employees, and a steady flow of passengers stopping between Baltimore and Washington. During the Civil War, the Union Army stationed troops at Relay specifically to guard the viaduct, which was one of the most strategically important railroad structures in the country. The railroad junction that had built the town was eventually bypassed by modern rail operations. The hotel burned, and Relay shrank to almost nothing. Today, it is a historic district of Hallethorpe, with almost no visible trace of the railroad community that once justified its existence, while the Thomas Viaduct itself still stands after nearly 200 years, still carrying trains on the same 8 stone arches, everything that was built around it gone, and the bridge still working. Number 1. St. Mary's City, Maryland. This was Maryland's first colonial capital, and the place where religious freedom was first written into American law. And when a Protestant governor was given his orders from England, he moved the capital, converted the State House into a church, and left the city to become a field. For 300 years, no one looked for it. What archaeologists found when they finally did is still being excavated today. St. Mary's City was founded in March 1634, when 2 ships, the Ark and the Dove, arrived in the Chesapeake Bay, carrying roughly 150 colonists, most of them Catholic, fleeing religious persecution in England. They purchased land from the Yaocomico people and built Maryland's first settlement. In 1649, the Maryland Toleration Act made religious tolerance the law of the colony, the first such legislation in North American history, 140 years before the First Amendment. For 60 years, St. Mary's City served as Maryland's capital. In 1689, a Protestant rebellion overthrew the Catholic Catholic government, and the British Crown installed a Protestant governor named Francis Nicholson. In 1695, he moved the capital to Annapolis. The State House was immediately converted into a Protestant church, and the governor's residence was destroyed in an explosion the same year. A large gunpowder magazine had been stored in the basement, and whether it was an accident has never been established. With no government function to sustain it, St. Mary's City emptied out within a generation. What was left behind was not rubble, it was a meadow. Because the city was never rebuilt over, the ground preserved the complete underground record of a colonial capital intact beneath the soil. Archaeologists have been excavating here since 1971 and have conducted over 300 digs. In 2018, ground-penetrating radar finally located the original 1634 fort, the footprint of the first structure ever erected in Maryland, hidden under a field for nearly 400 years, and still being excavated today. Drop a comment and tell me what town you're from in Maryland so we can feature it in the next video. Subscribe so you don't miss it.